Gideon Strake didn't knock. He never knocked. He kicked the door of the Bellamy farmhouse open so hard the iron hinges screamed, and the sound of it, that single violent crack against frozen wood, sent 6-year-old Tobin scrambling behind his mother's legs. The cattle baron walked in like he already owned the floors, the walls, the air inside. Maybe he believed he did. Men like Strake always believed that. He looked at Mara Bellamy standing in her dead husband's kitchen with a baby on one hip and a child pressed against her thigh, and he didn't see a grieving widow. He saw an obstacle. "You've got until sundown," he said. "After that, whatever's still inside becomes mine too." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. If that were you, your children, your home, the only life you had left, what would you do? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that kindness still exists in a hard world, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week we bring you stories of courage, heartbreak, and the quiet moments that change everything. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled, and if it touches your heart, leave a like. It helps more people find us. Now, let's go back to Frostpine Ridge, because the story of Silas Rourke and Mara Bellamy is just getting started. The cold that settled over Frostpine Ridge in the winter of 1887 was not the kind people in warmer places talked about. It wasn't picturesque. It didn't shimmer. It pressed down on everything like a hand trying to push a nail through stone, slow, indifferent, and relentless. The kind of cold that got into a man's lungs and reminded him how fragile the machinery of a living body truly was. Silas Rourke had stopped noticing it years ago. He moved through the forest the way a man moves through a room he knows by memory quietly, without hesitation, each step placed with the particular economy of someone who had spent 12 winters learning where the ice sat thin over the creek beds and where the snow-crusted ridges would hold a man's weight. He was 41 years old and looked closer to 50, the way men who work hard in hard places always do. His beard had gone mostly gray before he turned 38. His hands were large and rough and had broken things that needed breaking. He was not a man most people in the valley thought about warmly. He was not a man most people in the valley thought about at all, which suited him fine. He was checking his traps on the eastern slope when he heard it. Not a sound exactly. More like the absence of the right kind of sound, the specific quiet that happens when something alive is struggling and losing. He had spent enough time in the wilderness to know the difference between the silence of nothing and the silence of something trying not to make noise, because making noise costs too much energy. He stopped, tilted his head. 40 yards below him, half hidden by a collapsed snowdrift against the tree line, was a shape that shouldn't have been there. He moved toward it carefully, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned long ago that the moment you stop being careful was the moment something went badly wrong. He kept his rifle loose in his grip, not raised, just present, the way a careful man carries a tool he hopes he won't need. What he found stopped him cold, and Silas Rourke was not a man who stopped easily. A woman. Young, no, not so young, maybe 28 or 30, though exhaustion and cold had aged her in the way hardship always does. She crouched the snow, with her body curled around something small, and even in that state of near collapse, even with her arms shaking and her breath coming in ragged, visible clouds, she was still trying to position herself between the wind and whatever she was holding. It took Silas a half-second to realize she was holding 2 children. The older one, a boy, dark-haired, terrified, old enough to understand what cold meant, had both arms wrapped around her neck and his face pressed into her shoulder. The smaller one, an infant wrapped in layers of cloth that had gone damp from the snow, wasn't making any sound at all. That absence of sound from the baby is what hit Silas hardest. "Hey." He said it before he'd made any conscious decision to speak. "Hey, look at me." The woman's head came up. Her eyes were dark brown, and they held a particular look he recognized, not panic, not quite, but the look that comes right before panic, the look of someone who has been holding things together through sheer will for longer than will was designed to hold. She flinched when she saw him. Of course she did. Large man, rifle, middle of nowhere. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. He didn't know why he felt the need to say it. He'd never had cause to say it to anyone before, but something in her expression made the words come out on their own. Are you hurt? She stared at him for a moment. Her lips were pale. Not good, my daughter, she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised him. The steadiness of someone who has already decided they're not going to fall apart, because falling apart isn't an option. She stopped crying 20 minutes ago. I can't tell if She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Silas moved. He knelt in the nose beside her and didn't ask permission before pulling back the edge of the cloth around the infant. The baby was alive. Barely maybe, but alive. Cold but breathing. He could see the faint rise of her tiny chest if he looked hard enough. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. She's breathing, he said. The woman Mara, though he didn't know her name yet, made a sound, then that was nothing like crying and everything like it. A single exhaled breath that carried the weight of something that had been crushing her from the inside. My cabin's 1.5 miles north, Silas said, already standing. Can you walk? I can walk. She couldn't, really. Not well. But she tried what she supposed was the same thing in weather like this. The boy 6 years old, he'd later learn, named Tobin, walked beside his mother without a word the entire way, holding the edge of her coat with one hand. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He watched Silas with the wary, calculating eyes of a child who had learned too recently that the world was not reliably safe. Silas recognized that look too. He'd worn it himself once, a long time ago. He didn't try to make conversation on the walk back. He carried the infant because Mara's arms were trembling, and he'd decided that was the most useful thing he could do. Yep. The baby was warmer against his chest than she'd been wrapped in those damp layers, and somewhere around the half-mile mark she made a small, irritable sound, and he felt the tight thing in his chest loosen slightly. His cabin was not much to look at from the outside. He knew that. It was built for function, not impression thick logs, low roof, one window on the south side because south light was warmest. Inside was warmer than outside, which was the only thing that mattered right now. He pushed the door open and stood aside. Mara walked in and stopped just past the threshold. She looked around the single room, the narrow bed, the rough table, the iron stove already banked with coals, and he could see her cataloging it the way a person does when they're deciding whether they're safe. Then she looked at him. I need you to understand something, she said. Her voice was still steady. He was beginning to think steadiness was simply her nature. Gideon Strake is going to come for me. He's not going to stop. Silas set the baby down on the bed and turned to look at her. I know, Strake, he said. Then you know what it means if you help me. He crossed to the stove and started building the fire up properly. He didn't look at her. I know what it means. I don't have money to pay you. I don't have anything I didn't ask. Silence, then. Why? He didn't answer immediately, because he wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. He'd been alone for 12 years. He'd made peace with it. Or something close enough to peace that he'd stopped examining the difference. He had no reason to get involved in Mara Bellamy's troubles, and several clear reasons not to. But he'd watched her curl herself around those children in the snow. He'd watched her shake and refuse to let the shaking matter. He'd watched her carry something unbearable and not put it down. Get close to the fire, he said finally. Both of you. Tobin, who had been standing near the door this entire time, with the particular stillness of a child trying not to cause trouble, moved to the stove without hesitation. He held his hands out toward the heat, and Silas watched something in the boy's face change, as the warmth reached him a slow, involuntary softening like a fist unclenching. It was such a small thing. Such a completely human thing. Silas looked away. He found dry clothes, his own spare things, far too large, and without ceremony or explanation, set them on the table beside Mara. He turned his back while she changed and occupied himself with checking on the infant, who was now warm enough to be properly unhappy about something, and expressing this clearly. Elsie, Mara said. Her name is Elsie, hungry, Silas said, because the crying had the particular quality of hunger rather than pain. Yes. A pause. It's been 2 days since she stopped. 2 days. He turned that over in his head and didn't say anything about it. He had goat's milk he kept for trading. He heated some, managed the temperature carefully, and fashioned something workable for the infant from materials he had on hand. It wasn't elegant, it worked. Elsie ate with the concentrated intensity of someone with strong opinions, And Tobin watched this whole operation with an expression that Silas couldn't quite read, something between relief and a grief so complicated it had no name. It occurred to Silas, not for the first time since finding them in the snow, that this boy had been carrying more than a child should have to carry. "What happened to your husband?" he asked. He kept his voice flat. No particular gentleness to it, because he'd found that gentleness sometimes made things harder to say. Mara was sitting at his table now, the oversized shirt rolled up at the wrists, her dark hair loose and still damp at the ends. She looked at Tobin, who was playing with the hem of his coat, and pretending not to listen. "Tobin," she said quietly, "there's a blanket on the bed. You should sleep." The boy looked at her. He looked at Silas. Then he went to the bed, without argument, pulled the blanket over himself, and was asleep in roughly 4 minutes. Children could do that, Silas remembered dimly. Fall asleep the moment they were finally safe enough to let go. Mara turned back to him. "They said it was an accident," she said. "Calder was working the fence line along the river property, and his horse came back without him. They found him at the bottom of the ravine." She paused. "Gideon Strake came to the house 3 days later. He had papers. He said Calder owed him a debt, the property as collateral. He had 2 men with him and a document with my husband's name on it." Her jaw tightened. "Calder would have told me. He told me everything." "You think the debt was invented?" "I know the debt was invented." She said it without heat, without drama. Just certainty. "I just can't prove it." Silas poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot he kept perpetually on the stove and set one in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it, and he noticed her knuckles were split in 2 places, probably from the cold. "He gave me a week to leave with the children," she said. "I waited 4 days, trying to find someone in town who'd help. The sheriff told me Strake had legal documents, and there was nothing to be done. The lawyer in Millhaven said it would take months and cost money I don't have." She looked at her coffee. "So I decided to try to reach my brother in Cutter's Pass. I thought if I could get over the mountain in this weather." He didn't mean it as a criticism. It just came out. "In this weather," she agreed, and there was something almost wry in her voice. "My brother has a house. I thought if Tobin and Elsie could be somewhere safe, I could come back and fight." She said it like she meant it. Like coming back to fight a man with more money and men and influence than she had was simply the next step in a plan, not a kind of madness. He studied her for a moment. "Strake's not going to like this," he said. "I know. He'll come here." "I know," she met his eyes. "You can still tell me to leave, mister." She stopped. "I don't know your name." "Silas." "You can still tell me to leave, Silas. I won't think less of you for it. Nobody around here would." He looked at Tobin, asleep on his narrow bed with one hand tucked under his cheek. He looked at Elsie, small and warm and fed, her eyes half closed with the particular satisfaction of an infant whose complaints have been addressed. He looked at Mara, who was watching him with the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman, who had learned to accept hard truths and wasn't asking him to soften this one. He thought about 12 years of silence, 12 winters alone, the particular kind of quiet that filled a house that used to have other people in it and then didn't. "You'll take the bed," he said. "I'll manage." She opened her mouth. "Don't argue," he said, not harshly. "You need sleep. The baby needs to stay warm. In the morning we'll work out the rest." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite surprise, but lived somewhere between them. "Thank you," she said. Just that. He nodded and turned away before either of them could make more of it than it was. He sat up most of that night in the chair beside the stove, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind work itself against the cabin walls. He wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't the right word. He was calculating turning over terrain and distance and the particular personality of men like Strake, who were not violent by nature so much as by convenience, who used force the way they used money to make inconvenient things go away. He'd made himself into an inconvenient thing. Around 2 in the morning, Tobin woke from a bad dream and sat straight up with a sound that wasn't quite a cry. Silas was already across the room before the boy had fully surfaced from sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing because sometimes silence was more useful than words. Tobin looked at him in the dark, breathing hard. "You're the man from the snow," the boy said. "Yeah. Are they going to come?" Silas didn't insult him with a lie. "Probably," he said. Tobin considered this. "What will you do?" "I'll handle it." The boy stared at him a moment longer. Then he lay back down and pulled the blanket over himself and closed his eyes, with the kind of simple trust that children sometimes extended to adults who hadn't yet given them reason to do otherwise. It was such a fragile thing. It made Silas's chest hurt in a place that had been numb for a long time. He sat there in the dark for a while longer than he needed to. Then he went back to his chair. Outside, Frostpine Ridge pressed against the cabin walls and the temperature dropped, and the wind found every gap between the logs and tried them all. But the fire in the iron stove burned steady, and the 4 people inside it made it through the night. By morning, 3 armed riders were already climbing the hill. Silas heard them before he saw them. 3 horses working up the frozen trail made a particular sound, the careful, deliberate rhythm of animals being pushed harder than the ice justified, which meant the men on their backs were either reckless or certain enough of their authority that caution seemed beneath them. He'd been up since before first light, had already fed the stove and heated water, and stood at the south window watching the tree line. The way a man watches a thing he knows is coming, but can't know exactly when. He set his coffee cup down. "Stay inside," he said to the room. Mara was already awake. She'd been awake for a while, he suspected, doing the same arithmetic he was doing, weighing odds, measuring distances, trying to find a favorable equation in a situation that didn't have one. She was sitting at the table with Elsie against her chest, and when he said it, she looked at him with those steady dark eyes and didn't argue, which he respected. Tobin was awake, too. The boy had a way of waking without sound, without the gradual surfaces most children needed. He was simply asleep, and then he wasn't, watching everything with those careful eyes. Silas pulled on his coat and went outside. The cold hit him the way it always did, not as a shock anymore, but as a fact, like stepping into a room with a particular smell. He stood on the low porch and waited, and after about 2 minutes, the riders came out of the tree line and stopped about 30 yards out. 3 men. 2 of them he didn't know hired muscle, the kind Strake kept on rotation, interchangeable in the way that men who do other men's violence tend to be. The 3rd man he knew. Gideon Strake was 60 years old and had the build of a man who had once done real physical work and then spent 20 years watching other men do it for him. He sat his horse well. He had a trimmed gray mustache and pale eyes that held a quality. Silas had noticed in certain men the particular flatness that comes from spending decades making decisions about other people's lives, and never having to personally live with the consequences. "Silas Rourke," Strake said. Not a greeting. More like an identification of a problem. "Strake, you've got somebody in your cabin that doesn't belong there." Silas looked at him without expression. "I've got 3 people in my cabin that I invited." Strake's horse shifted under him and he steadied it with one hand. Easy. Automatic. "The Bellamy woman has a legal obligation to vacate the property she was occupying. I've got papers. She knows this. She's not on her property. She's on mine. She's still my business." "That, right." Silas said it flat. Not a question. One of the hired men, younger, with the particular restlessness of someone who was hoping this would escalate, moved his hand toward his hip. Not to draw, just to remind everyone it was an option. Silas clocked it and looked back at Strake. "You want to tell your boy to relax," he said. "He makes me nervous, and I make bad decisions when I'm nervous." Strake looked at the younger man and made a small movement with 2 fingers. The hand came away from the hip. "You're not stupid, Silas," Strake said. He had a voice like wagon wheels on dry gravel, not loud, but with a weight to it that traveled. "You've kept to yourself out here for years. Nobody bothers you. You don't bother anyone. That's a good arrangement. It's been fine. This woman is trouble. Whatever she's told you about her husband, about the property, she's a woman alone with 2 children and a story, and she needs someone to believe it. I understand the appeal." He paused. "I'm telling you the debt was real. The property transfer was legal. Whatever you think you're doing, you're putting yourself in the middle of something that has nothing to do with you." Silas was quiet for a moment. The wind came across the hillside and found the back of his neck above the coat collar, and he ignored it. "You've got a man who died in a ravine," he said. 3 days later you show up at his widow's door with papers. I've been in this valley a long time. I know how you work." Something shifted in Strake's expression. "Not much." "Enough, you've got until sunrise tomorrow," Strake said. "After that, I stop being reasonable." He turned his horse, and the two men turned with him, and they rode back down the hill the way they'd come, deliberate and unhurried, the way men ride when they want you to watch them leave. And understand that leaving was a choice they made. Silas stood on the porch until they were back in the tree line. Then he went inside. Mara was standing. She'd heard all of it. The cabin walls weren't thick enough to stop voices carrying in cold air. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something between apology and a harder thing underneath it. "I should go," she said. "Where?" "I'll figure see something." "Where, Mara?" He took his coat off and hung it on the peg by the door. "You were half frozen in a snowdrift yesterday." Elsie wasn't making noise. "You've got nowhere to go and no way to get there. And Strake knows it. That's the whole play. He wants you scared and moving, because scared people moving in winter make mistakes." She stared at him. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly, just with the particular directness of a man who'd spent 12 years talking mainly to himself and had lost patience for the long way around things. "Drink your coffee. Let me think." She sat. He could tell it cost her something. Mara Bellamy was not a woman who sat while things needed doing, but she sat. Tobin was watching him from across the room. The boy had been quiet through the whole exchange, sitting very still near the stove with his knees pulled up, and now he was looking at Silas with an expression that was trying hard not to be hopeful and not quite succeeding. "Are you going to make them go away?" Tobin asked. Mara said Tobin, in a voice that meant don't put that on him. "I'm going to try," Silas said, because the boy deserved an honest answer more than a comfortable one. Tobin nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Okay," he said, like it was enough. Like trying was enough. Silas didn't know what to do with that. Exactly, so he turned to the stove and Destvin started making breakfast. They ate without much talking. Silas made cornmeal mush because it was what he had and what kept heat in a body, and Tobin ate it without complaint, which Silas noted approvingly. Mara fed Elsie and watched him with a sideways attention he was aware of but didn't address. After a while she said, "You knew Calder." It wasn't a question. "Knew of him," Silas said. "We weren't close." "I don't get close." "But you knew his reputation." "Good man, kept his word, worked hard." He paused. "The kind of man who doesn't borrow money from Gideon Strake because he knows what borrowing from Strake means." Something in Mara's face tightened and then deliberately relaxed. "He would never," she said. "Even when things were hard on the ranch, he would have sold cattle first. He would have sold the tools. He would have," she stopped, breathed. "He hid papers in the farmhouse. Before everything happened. He told us once that if anything ever went wrong with the river property, there were papers in the floor of the root cellar. I thought he meant the deed. Insurance documents, maybe." She looked at her hands. "I never got back to look." Silas was quiet. The root cellar of the Bellamy farmhouse was 9 miles south, through open terrain that Strake's men would be watching. He thought about this in the way he thought about most problems systematically, without letting the difficulty of it become a reason not to try. "I know that land," he said finally. "Everyone knows it's Strake territory now. Strake's people know the road. They're not going to be sitting in a tree in the back field in this weather." He watched her. "What kind of papers did Calder put down there?" "I don't know." He wouldn't say specifically. He said it was protection. Her voice caught slightly on the last word, then steadied. "I thought he was being dramatic. He worried more than he ever let on." She looked away. "I should have pushed harder." "Probably," Silas said, because softening it wouldn't help her, and she'd already demonstrated she didn't need things softened. "But you didn't know what he knew." She looked back at him, and for a moment he saw what it cost her, the years of asking herself the questions that had the good answers, the particular torture of hindsight, applied to something that couldn't be changed. Then she put it away, the way she put most things away, with a quiet internal efficiency that he was specific to recognize as her specific survival mechanism. "If we could get to those papers," she said. "If," he agreed. The retaliation started that same afternoon. He should have anticipated it, and he told himself later that he had, mostly, but the speed of it was faster than he'd modeled. He went out around midday to check the horses in the lean-to shelter he kept at the north edge of his property, and they were gone. Not loose, the lead lines had been cut clean, which meant someone had come up from the east while he'd been inside. The tracks went south, several horses moving together, already 30 minutes gone in the conditions. He stood in the empty shelter and felt a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Both horses, his winter stock. Without horses, he was half the man he needed to be in this situation. He went back inside and said nothing for a moment, which apparently was enough because Mara looked at his face and said, "What happened?" before he'd decided how to start. "Horses are gone." She absorbed this. How? Cut the lines. Came in quiet from the east. He sat down and looked at his hands. Straight's not waiting until sunrise. Tobin made a small sound, and Mara put a hand on his shoulder without looking automatic, the practiced comfort of a mother who had learned to soothe without turning away from the problem. "He's trying to strand us," she said. "He's trying to strand me," Silas said. He's trying to frighten into doing what he wants." "Is it working?" She said it without sarcasm. A genuine question. "On you?" He looked at her. "No." She nodded. Something settled in her expression, not relief exactly, but the particular solidity of someone who has found something to stand next to. He understood that he was now that thing, and the weight of it was not entirely unwelcome, which surprised him. He spent the rest of that afternoon checking the cabin's vulnerabilities, the window, the door, the angle of the slope, and what it meant for visibility and approach. He reinforced the door bar with a second timber bracket he'd had in storage. He moved Tobin's sleeping arrangement away from the window without explaining why, just saying the corner was warmer, which was true, though incomplete. Mara watched all of this and helped where she could without needing to be asked what to do. She had an instinct for practical things that he respected. She saw what needed doing and did it without ceremony or complaint or the need for acknowledgement. By late afternoon, the cabin was as secure as it was going to get, which was not very secure at all, a fact they were both aware of. And neither stated aloud because stating it would have been purely decorative. The night passed without incident, which was almost worse. He sat up again in the chair, listening. The forest outside was quiet, the way it went quiet sometimes before something happened, the particular held breath of the world pausing between one thing and the next. He kept the fire low enough that light wouldn't carry through the window seam. Around midnight, he heard Mara shift in the bed, and then the specific sound of someone lying awake, pretending not to be. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." A pause. "I keep thinking about what Calder knew," she said, her voice soft enough not to wake the children. "If he hid papers. If he knew something was wrong before the ravine." Another pause. Longer. "He would have told me to get out. If he'd known, he would have made me take the children and leave. Maybe he didn't know how serious it was," Sisla said. "Men underestimate things when they're in the middle of them. Think they can manage. You never met him." "No. But it's a thing men do." Silence, then quietly. "Do you do that?" He thought about that honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. Probably. Yes. He heard something that might have been a very small, very tired sound of near laughter, which was the last thing he expected. It was gone almost before it was there. "Calder used to say the measure of a man wasn't whether he made mistakes," she said. "It was what he did after." Silas didn't say anything to that. He sat with it. In the morning, his traps were wrecked. He found them on his daily check of the eastern line, 12 traps he'd set along the creek beds over the course of the fall, each one representing hours of placement and positioning. Every single one had been sprung, bent, or smashed beyond salvage. 8 years of accumulated trapping equipment, some of it replaced and repaired multiple times, all of it gone in what had probably been an organized 2-hour operation by 4 or 5 men with iron bars. He stood over the wreckage of the last one, a double-spring beaver trap that had been his father's, and that he had repaired so many times there was almost nothing of the original left, but that he had kept anyway and felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not grief, anger, the clean, clear kind, not hot, not blind, the cold variety that knew exactly what it wanted. He was walking back toward the cabin when he smelled it. Smoke. Not the ordinary smoke of his chimney. The particular smell of wood burning wrong too fast with the chemical edge of accelerant mixed in. He ran. The barn he'd kept calling it a barn, though it was more of a large storage structure, was fully involved. By the time he got there, the north wall already compromised, the roof sagging. He could hear the roar of it, the way a large fire had its own voice, and inside that sound the smaller sounds of things burning that had taken him years to accumulate. Spare harness, feed stores, tools, lumber he'd been aging for 3 winters. There was nothing to do for it. He stood and watched it burn. Mara had come out when she smelled the smoke, Elsie bundled against her chest. Tobin stood at her side, holding her coat again. In that way he had. They watched it with him, and nobody said anything because there was nothing useful to say. After a while, Silas turned away from the barn. The anger was still there, banked down now, controlled, but it was not going anywhere. He's not going to stop, Mara said. Not an accusation. Just a reckoning, no. He's going to keep taking things until there's nothing left to take, and then he'll come for us directly. That's the plan, Silas agreed. He looked at her. So wait for it. She was watching him with that particular steadiness. What do you mean? You said Calder hid papers in the farmhouse. Documents that might prove the debt was false. He kept his eyes on hers. I mean, we go get them. She blinked. Strake's men will be watching the farmhouse. Some of them. Not all of them. He's also got them out here, cutting my lines and burning my barn, which means he's split his people up. He paused. And he won't expect to move toward him. That's because moving toward him is insane. Probably, Silas said. But doing nothing buys us maybe 2 days before he stops the Patience Act and comes with all of them at once. He looked at the barn still burning, at the thin black column of smoke going straight up in the windless cold morning. At least this way we choose the ground. Mara was quiet for a long moment. He could see her working through it, the risk of going, the certainty of what would happen if they stayed. The particular math of someone who was choosing between two bad options and trying to figure out which one left the door more open. Tobin stays here, she said finally. Silas shook his head. Can't leave him alone. He's sick, Silas. I know how old he is. I also know what happens if Strake's men come while we're gone. Tobin stays with us. She didn't like it. He could see that plainly. But she couldn't argue with the logic. Tobin, who had been listening to all of this with the particular focus of a child who understood more than adults, wished he did, looked up at Silas. I won't slow you down, he said. It was such a serious thing for a 6-year-old to say that Silas had to look away for a moment. I know, he said. You've been solid this whole time. The boy straightened slightly, some specific thing in him responding to that, and Silas thought, Calder Bellamy had done something right with this kid. Whatever had been taken from Tobin in the last weeks, it hadn't taken the thing underneath. They left in the early afternoon, moving south through terrain that Silas knew the way he knew his own hands. He didn't use the road. He took the creek route that wound down through the lower timber, adding 1.5 miles to the distance, but keeping them off any sightline that Strake's men would be covering. He carried Elsie against his chest in a carrier Mara had fashioned from one of his spare blankets, because it freed both his hands and kept the baby warm, and when she'd first offered this arrangement, he'd looked at it for a moment and then accepted without comment because it was practical. He was aware of how it looked. He was more aware of how it felt, the small warm weight against his chest, the specific trust of it. The infant's head tucked under his chin. He hadn't held a baby in 12 years. He'd been careful not to think about that fact for most of those 12 years. He thought about it now, briefly, and then put it away because the creek ice was thin at the bend, and he needed to concentrate. They made good time. Tobin moved through the snow with a competence that Silas hadn't expected. The boy had clearly spent time in rough country, had learned to watch where he put his feet. Once, crossing a tricky section of ice, he reached back and took his mother's hand without being asked. And Mara took it without looking at him, both of them doing it automatically. The practiced choreography of people who moved through difficult terrain together. Silas found himself watching them more than he should have. He stopped doing that and watched the tree line instead. The Bellamy farmhouse came into view through the bare timber as they crested a low rise about a 1/4 mile out. Silas stopped and studied it for several minutes. The structure was intact but dark. The windows boarded Strake had done that, probably, to make the property look settled and inaccessible. There was no visible movement, no horses tied outside, no smoke. I don't see anyone, Mara murmured beside him. Doesn't mean they're not there. He watched for another 5 minutes. The light was going to start dropping in about an hour and a half, which was both a problem and a resource, depending on how the next 20 minutes went. If someone's inside, he said, they'll be in the front room where it's warmest. The root cellar access is through the kitchen, correct? Behind the flower shelf. Kitchen's at the back. We come in from the east side, we may miss them entirely. He looked at her. Or we may not, I understand. Tobin. He looked at the boy. You stay outside with Elsie. Here, at the tree line, out of sight. If you hear gunfire, Silas, Mara started. If you hear gunfire, he said to Tobin directly, you take your sister and you run north up the creek line. There's a trapper's shelter half a mile up, built against a granite outcrop. You can't miss it. You stay there. Tobin's face was very still. He was working to keep it that way. What about you and Mama? We'll be right behind you, but if we're not, he held the boy's gaze. You take Elsie to that shelter and you wait. Someone will come. What if no one comes? It was such a clear-eyed, practical question. Such a Mara question in a 6-year-old's voice. Then in the morning, you keep going north toward Frostpine Ridge and you ask for Marshal Vale, Silas said. You tell him where we are and what happened. Can you remember that? Vale. Marshal Orson Vale. Vale, Tobin repeated, like he was memorizing it. He probably was. Mara transferred Elsie to Tobin with the careful efficiency of a woman who had done this many times and found a position that worked, arranging the baby against her brother's chest in a way that distributed the weight. Most of its windows were dark. She kissed Tobin on the forehead and pulled back before she could make it something that might crack them both open. Then she and Silas moved toward the farmhouse. They went in. Its windows were dark. They went in through the east side, moving low and close to the wall, and for the first 15 feet, Silas's entire attention was divided between the boarded window above them and his own footsteps in the snow. He went first, Mara half a step behind, and when they reached the back door, the kitchen door, he stood the handle, not locked. Strake's men had gotten careless, or they hadn't anticipated anyone coming back. He pushed it open slowly. Dark inside, colder than outside, the specific damp cold of a sealed space that hadn't had a fire in weeks. He listened for 10 full seconds before moving. Nothing. They went in. Mara went directly for the flower shelf on the back wall, with a certainty that told him she'd rehearsed this in her mind 100 times exactly where to reach, exactly how to move it. He stayed by the door, watching the hallway that led to the front room, his rifle up, listening for the creak of a floorboard or the shift of weight in another room. The shelf scraped against the floor as Mara pulled it out. Behind it, the root cellar hatch. She went down. He stayed at the door. 30 seconds. 45. He heard her moving below him. The soft sounds of searching boards moved. Something shifted. He watched the hallway. The front of the house was silent. Then Mara's head came up through the hatch. She was holding a leather pouch, flat and sealed with a cord, the kind used for important documents that needed to survive moisture or hard use. In her other hand, a sealed letter with a wax stamp he didn't recognize. She was breathing fast. Her eyes were bright. Calder, she said, meaning the papers were his, meaning they'd been here this whole time, meaning he'd left this for her the way a man leaves a lantern on when he doesn't know how late someone will be coming home. Take them, Silas said. We need to...
The front door blew open.
Not opened. Blew. The kind of entry made by a man who doesn't need to be quiet anymore because he's got 4 men with him and he's been watching the east side of the farmhouse since they entered, and he has been very, very patient. Gideon Strake stepped into the hallway. His voice was different now, flatter. The performance of reasonableness completely gone. Well, he said, there it is. Silas moved to put himself between Strake and Mara, and he was already calculating distances, angles, the position of the other men, whether the back door was still clear. But when Strake raised his own rifle and the 4 men spread out behind him in the shadows of the front room, and Ceaseless understood immediately and completely that the math had just gotten much, much worse. Strake looked at the leather pouch in Mara's hand. I'll take that, he said. Mara took 1 step back. She pressed the pouch against her chest with both arms, the same automatic, unconscious gesture she'd used to shield her children in the snow. Protecting the thing that mattered most with the only thing she had, her body. Silas stood between all of them and watched Strake's pale eyes and calculated what he had left to work with, and the number was not large. The anger he'd felt standing over his destroyed traps and his burning barn was still there, still cold and clean, and he let it settle into something useful. He was going to need it. Strake, he said. His voice came out even. You're making a mistake. Put the rifle down, Silas. Killing us won't make those papers disappear. Other people know about them. That, Strake said, is a lie. He wasn't wrong. Silas filed that away. He needed to not be lying the next time he said something, and he needed to find the something very quickly. Outside, in the tree line a quarter mile north, Tobin sat with his sister pressed against his chest and listened to the silence and waited, the way Silas had told him to, counting the seconds the way a child counts when counting is the only thing left to do. He was very good at waiting. He was his mother's son. Inside the dark farmhouse, Mara held Calder's papers and refused to move, and Silas Rourke stood in front of her and looked at 5 armed men and tried to figure out what came next. Because there was going to be a next, and it was going to be ugly, and he had promised a 6-year-old boy he was going to be right behind him. He intended to keep that promise, even if keeping it cost him considerably more than he'd been prepared to pay. Silas did the only thing a man could do when the math was that bad. He stalled. "Those papers belong to Mara Bellamy," he said, keeping his voice level, keeping his body positioned between Strake and Mara, without making it look like a defensive posture. More like he'd just happened to be standing there. "Her husband's name is on them. You take them by force in front of 4 witnesses. That's not a legal dispute anymore. That's robbery." Strake's expression didn't change. "My men don't witness things they're not asked to witness." "No, I imagine they don't." One of the 4 men in the shadows, the same young one from the porch visit, the restless one, took a step forward. Silas shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, just enough to change his angle, and the young man stopped, not because Silas had done anything threatening, because there was something in the way Silas moved that communicated, quietly and without drama, that moving toward him was going to be more complicated than it looked. "Here's what I know," Silas said. He kept his eyes on Strake. Because Strake was the decision in this room, the 4 hired men were just the consequences. Calder Bellamy didn't borrow money from you. I don't know exactly what's in those papers yet, but I know whatever it is, you've known about it long enough to be standing in this kitchen, waiting for us to come find them. Which means you know they're a problem for you. Strake's jaw tightened. Small movement. But Silas had been reading men in tight situations for a long time, and small movements were where the truth lived. "Put the rifle down," Strake said again. "No." The word sat in the cold kitchen air between them. "You've got 1 rifle, Silas. I've got 5 men." "You've got 5 men in 1 doorway," Silas said, "and I've been shooting in tight spaces since before some of those boys were born." He paused. "First shot's yours, Strake. I'm saying think hard about whether you want to be the one to fire it." It was a bluff, and it wasn't. He could take 1 or 2 of them before the numbers closed the argument permanently. The question was whether Strake believed he was willing to do it. And the answer to that question depended entirely on whether Strake was the kind of man who looked at another man and understood what he was seeing. Strake looked at him for a long moment. Then he made a small gesture with his hand. Not retreat, Strake didn't retreat. More of a pause. A recalculation. "This isn't finished," he said. "It won't be," Silas agreed. Strake looked past him at Mara. His pale eyes rested on her with a cold specificity that Silas didn't like and couldn't do anything about. "You're going to hand those over eventually," he said to her. "Everything has a price, Mrs. Bellamy, including stubbornness." Mara didn't move. She didn't flinch. She held the leather pouch against her chest and looked at Jin Strake with an expression that was not defiant. Defiance was too easy, too young. What was in her face was older and harder than defiance. It was if its windows were dark. It was the look of someone who had already lost the worst thing she was going to lose, and had learned from the losing that she was still standing. Strake turned and walked back toward the front room. His men moved with him, the young one last, still watching Silas, with that restless frozen someone who'd been ready for something, and was annoyed he didn't get it. Then they were gone. The front door opened and closed. Silas waited 15 seconds before he moved to the back door and eased it open, watching the yard and the tree line. He heard horses multiple sets, moving away south, taking the road. He watched for another 30 seconds. "They're leaving," Mara said behind him. Her voice was completely steady. He turned and looked at her and saw, for just a moment, the faintest tremor in her hands before she closed them more firmly around the pouch. She'd been terrified. She'd been terrified the whole time, and not 1 syllable of it had come out in her voice. For now, he said, "How long did we buy?" "Not long. He's going to come back with more men, and he's not going to talk first." Silas moved back into the kitchen. "Open the pouch. I need to know what we're carrying." She pulled the cord loose, with fingers that weren't entirely steady, and drew out the contents, several folded pages and the sealed letter. She unfolded the pages and read while Silas watched the window. The silence went on for about a minute. Then she said, very quietly, Calder paid the debt. He looked at her. There's a receipt here. Dated 8 months before he died. Signed by Strake's own land agent. She was reading fast, turning pages. Full settlement. Witnessed by 2 men in Millhaven. The debt was cleared. Her voice shook slightly on the last word, then steadied. Strake had a cleared debt, and he filed the property seizure anyway. He assumed Calder hadn't made copies. He assumed there was no record. She looked up. There's more. Calder wrote this himself, notes, dates, conversations he had with a man named Pike about survey work on the river property. A man who came twice asking about mineral rights. The name meant nothing to Silas yet. And the letter? She broke the wax seal and read it. The trembling in her hands got worse. Then she folded it carefully and looked at him with something in her eyes that was more complicated than anything he had a word for. Calder knew something was wrong weeks before he died, she said. He wrote this for me. In case. She stopped. He said the riverland had been surveyed privately without his knowledge. He said a man named Ransom Pike was behind it. He said Pike worked for himself, not for Strake, and that Strake was involved, but didn't understand the full picture. She paused. He said if anything happened to him, the debt claim was false, and the documents were here, and that I should trust the evidence over anyone's word, including his. Her voice cracked, just at the end, and she turned her face away and pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth for a moment. Silas looked at the wall. He gave her the moment, because she had earned 10,000 of them and was only taking 1. Silver, he said quietly. It had been sitting at the edge of his thinking since Part 2, since she'd mentioned the survey work on the river property. The geography of it clicked into place, the specific bend of the Bellamy River acreage, the rock formation underneath, the way that land sat in relation to the mineral country 2 ridges east. He found silver on your land. Mara lowered her wrist and looked at him. You think that's what Pike was surveying? I think a man doesn't arrange for another man to fall into a ravine over an unpaid debt on a mid-sized cattle ranch, Silas said. There's not enough money in that. But mineral rights on a river property that sits on top of a silver deposit. He shook his head slowly. That's a different conversation. She stood very still for a moment, processing the architecture of it, Calder's death, Pike's surveys, Strake's property seizure, all of it suddenly rearranging itself into a shape that was larger and uglier than a simple land grab. Calder didn't know about the silver, she said. He wrote about the surveys as suspicious, not as he didn't know what Pike was looking for. No. He just knew someone was looking, and that was enough to get him killed. Silas didn't soften it. Yes. She put the papers back in the pouch and tied the cord with deliberate, careful movements, like someone performing a specific task, because performing it gave their hands something to do while the rest of them caught up. We need to move, Silas said. They went out the back and into the darkening afternoon, moving fast toward the tree line and the spot where Silas had positioned Tobin. The light was going another 40 minutes before it was genuinely timber, but the shadows were already merging in the timber, and the temperature was dropping the way it dropped in the mountains when the sun left, not gradually but all at once, like a door closing. They found Tobin exactly where Silas had told him to be. The boy was sitting at the base of a large pine with Elsie against his chest, and both arms wrapped around her and his chin tucked down toward her head, using his own body hot, the way he'd seen his mother do it. When he saw Mara, he got up, full up, keeping the baby steady, and walked toward her without running, still maintaining that particular controlled composure that he shouldn't have needed at 6 years old. Mara took Elsie and pressed her face against her daughter's and didn't make any sound. Tobin looked at Silas. I heard horses leave. You did good, Silas said, staying put. That was the right call. The boy nodded. He looked at his mother for a moment and then back at Silas. What happens now? We get back to the cabin. Then we figure out the next part. They moved. Silas took a different route back, looping further west than they'd come, adding distance but reducing the chance of running into Strake's men repositioning on the road. He was thinking the whole way about Pike, about the name he didn't recognize, about the fact that there was apparently a second player in this situation who was not Strake, and who might be more dangerous than Strake precisely because he was less visible. A man who would have another man thrown into a ravine over silver deposits was a man with a particular kind of patience and a particular kind of ruthlessness that made Strake's open intimidation look almost manageable by comparison. They reached the cabin just as full darks settled over the ridge. The barn was a low pile of charred timber and ash, still faintly smoking at the edges. Silas walked past it without looking and opened the cabin door and got everyone inside and got the fire built up. He didn't speak while he was doing this. He was doing the silent arithmetic of a man who had realized the situation was worse than he'd thought and was trying to find the place in it where he still had options. After the children were settled and Mara had fed Elsie and Tobin had eaten the last of the cornmeal mush with the philosophical acceptance of a child who understands there isn't more, Silas spread Calder's documents on the table and looked at them in the firelight. The receipts were clean and dated. The letter was in Calder's handwriting, which Mara confirmed, and it was specific enough about dates and names that it would take actual effort to dismiss in front of anyone with legal authority. The mention of Pike and the private surveys was the most valuable piece it created, a thread that led somewhere beyond Strake, somewhere to a name and a motive that explained Calder's death in terms that a murder charge required. "Who's Vale?" Mara asked. She'd heard him tell Tobin the name. "You mentioned him. Orson Vale. Federal marshal out of Millhaven. He's not Strake's man. Strake never managed to get to him, far as I know. He's old, and he's slow, and he's not someone you'd pick for a fight, but he follows the law the way some men follow religion. Inflexibly." He paused. "These documents in his hands become a problem for Strake that money can't solve. Can we get to him? We'd have to get to Millhaven, which is 2 days south. Without horses." He looked at the documents. "And Strake's going to move before we could get there." She was quiet for a moment. "What about getting a message to him? Strake owns most of the reliable riders in this valley." "Most," she said. He looked at her. "Not all," she said. He thought about that. She was right. Technically. There were 2 or 3 people in Frostpine Ridge who weren't in Strake's orbit. Old Clem Hatter, who ran the feed store and hated Strake for a reason that went back 15 years and involved a water rights dispute and 2 dead cattle. The widow Parsons, who had enough land and enough stubbornness to have never needed anything from Strake and therefore owed him nothing. But getting to them meant going into town, and going into town meant being visible. "I could go," Mara said. "No, I know those people." Hatter knew Calder. They traded favors for years. "If I showed him the receipt, the letter, if Strake sees you in town with those papers, he takes them. He's got men there. He's probably got someone watching right now." Silas looked at his hands. "I go. I know the back route into town. I can be in and out without using the main street. And leave us here alone." The statement sat between them. He looked at her. She was right, and they both knew she was right, and neither of them had a clean answer to it. Strake might come to the cabin while he was gone. Strake might not. There was no way to know, and every choice he had left was a choice between types of risk, rather than a choice between risk and safety, because safety had stopped being available sometime yesterday. "You can shoot," he said. It wasn't a question. Something in her bearing told him. The way she'd looked at Strake's rifle earlier, without flinching. "Calder taught me. My other rifle's at your chest under the bed. Ammunition's wrapped in cloth beside it." He held her gaze. "If someone comes before I'm back, you don't open the door. You don't negotiate. You put Tobin and Elsie in the corner, and you cover the door, and you don't let anyone through it." She held his gaze right back. "I understand. I mean it, Mara. So do I." Pause. "Go before it gets later," he went. He pulled his coat on and took his rifle and went back into the dark and the cold, moving south through the timber toward Frostpine Ridge. And the particular sensation of leaving them behind in that cabin was something he identified, after a moment, as the sensation of having something to lose. He hadn't had that in 12 years, and he had forgotten how much heavier it made everything. He reached Hatter's feed store through the back alley, moving along the rear of the buildings the way he'd moved through the Bellamy farmhouse, without light, without hurry, reading the snow for recent tracks. He knocked 3 times on the back door with the specific interval pattern that old-timers in this part of the valley used for night calls. Clem Hatter was 73 years old, built like a fence post, and had the disposition of a man who had spent his life watching stronger men push other people around and had developed a deep structural hatred of it. He opened the back door, looked at Silas, and said, "You look like hell." "I've had a difficult 2 days," Silas said. Hatter stepped back and let him in. His store was dark. The front shuttered. He led Silas to the back room, where he kept his books and lit a single lamp low and looked at what Silas laid on his table. He read everything slowly. He was the kind of man who read slowly on purpose, because he'd lived long enough to know that the second reading usually found something the first one missed. When he was done, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Cleared debt, he said. Dated 8 months back. Yes. And Strake filed the seizure 3 weeks after Calder died. Yes, son of Ott himself. Looked at Silas. Where's the widow now? My cabin. With the children. And you're here. I need someone to ride to Millhaven. Someone Strake doesn't own. Hatter was quiet. He looked at the documents again, with the expression of a man being asked to step into something large and deciding whether his legs were still good enough for it. Then he looked at Silas with eyes that were old and tired and completely clear. My nephew came in yesterday, he said. 19 years old, good horse, no debts. He doesn't know Strake from a fence post. A pause. He rode for a marshal once before, 2 years back. Knows the protocol. Can he leave tonight? I'll get him up. Silas left copies of the key documents with Hatter Calder's letter and the debt receipts, which were the 2 clearest pieces, and kept the rest. Hatter's nephew was a serious-faced young man who looked at the task with the flat acceptance of someone who understood that this was real and handled real things by just doing them, and Silas decided he had enough faith in that to build on. He was back on the trail toward his cabin within an hour. It was the longest hour and a half of travel he could remember. Not because of the cold or the terrain, but because of the particular quality of listening. For sounds that shouldn't be there, the crack of timber, the movement of horses, the voices of men who had decided patience was finished. He heard none of it. The mountain was quiet and dark and brutally cold, and he moved through it as fast as he could without compromising his footing, which twice he did anyway, going down on one knee in the icy creek shallows and feeling the cold water immediately penetrate his boot. He told himself they were fine. He told himself Strake would wait for morning, because even Strake's men didn't love working in full dark in this weather. He told himself these things with the particular discipline of a man who knew the difference between useful optimism and self-deception and was walking the line between them carefully. He came up the last rise toward the cabin. The light was still in the window. The door was intact. He let out a breath. He knocked before opening because he'd told her to cover the door, and a moment later he heard the bar lift and Mara opened it and looked at him with an expression that she immediately arranged into something more neutral, but not before he'd seen the relief in it, which was large and unguarded and gone in an instant. You're back, she said. Said I would be. You're wet. She looked at his boot. Creak. Move. He came inside and she stepped aside and he got the boot off and got his foot near the stove because the cold in it was starting to become the kind of cold that caused damage rather than just discomfort. Tobin was asleep on the bed. Elsie was asleep beside him, tucked close. The rifle was on the table, exactly where it should have been close and accessible, and he looked at that and felt something ease in his chest. Hatter's nephew is riding for Millhaven, he said. Mara sat across the table from him. How long? 2 days to get there if he rides hard. Another day for Vale to mobilize. We need to hold 3 days. Absorb this. He could see her calculating the same way he had been 3 days. Reduced supplies, no horses, and Strake, about to stop being theatrical about it. He's going to come in force, she said. Yes, probably tomorrow night or the morning after. We can't defend this cabin against that many men. No. He looked at her. But we don't need to defend it forever. We just need to hold long enough for the law to become a factor. Once Vale has those documents, Strake coming after us stops being inconvenient and starts being evidence. She was looking at him with a steadiness that he'd come to recognize as the way Mara, Bellamy thought through the surface of things, past fear to the mechanism underneath. You've been protecting us since the first night, she said. Not an accusation, not exactly a compliment. Just an observation being placed in front of him. Trying to, he said. You lost your barn, your horses, your traps, she paused. You haven't complained once. Complaining doesn't fix anything. Most men would still do it. He looked at the fire. I'm not most men, I've been told that. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that he saw the shape of it at the corner of her mouth, and it was the first time since he'd found her in the snow that he'd seen anything in her face that wasn't vigilance or grief. Calder would have liked you, she said quietly. He didn't know what to do with that, so he didn't do anything with it. Get some sleep, he said. I'll keep watch. You've kept watch every night. I don't sleep much, anyway. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely parse, then went to the bed and lay down carefully beside the children without disturbing them. He turned to the fire and built it up slightly and sat in the chair with his rifle. He was thinking about Pike, about the name in Calder's letter specific, named documented. A man who had surveyed the river property without permission, who had arranged for Calder to go over a ravine, who had then maneuvered Strake into the property seizure, probably without Strake fully understanding what he was part of. A man who existed somewhere in the periphery of all of this and hadn't shown himself yet. That was the thing about Pike that bothered Silas more than anything Strake had done. Strake was in front of you. Strake made noise and sent men and burned things. You could see Strake coming. Pike was the kind of man who was already there before you thought to look. Around 3 a.m, a sound reached him from outside. Not the wind, not the creek. The specific compressed sound of weight on snow, being distributed wrong, the sound of someone trying to move quietly and not completely succeeding. Silas was out of the chair and at the wall beside the window before the sound had fully resolved in his mind. He looked through the window seam without putting his face in front of the glass. One figure, moving alone, coming from the east, not the road from the timber side, which meant either someone very careful or someone who knew the property well enough to approach from the blind angle. He was tall, moving with a particular loose-limbed ease that wasn't Strake and wasn't any of Strake's men that Silas had seen. Dressed for the cold and the dark, both everything dark, nothing that caught light. He stopped about 20 yards from the cabin. Silas couldn't see his face, but he could see the rifle the man carried, and the particular way he held it, not in the carrying position, but in the ready position, loose but oriented. The position of a man who expected to use it. The figure stood for a long moment looking at the cabin, looking at the light in the window, looking at the situation the way a man looks at a problem he's about to solve. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. Silas didn't move from the wall for a full minute. It wasn't Strake. It wasn't Strake's men. This was something else. Someone else. And he had just looked at this cabin and at the light in the window and had decided not yet. But soon Silas stood in the dark beside the window and understood with a cold clarity that the thing he'd been worried about, the larger shape of the danger behind Strake, had just made itself visible for the first time. Ransom Pike had come to see for himself, and when Pike came back, he wasn't going to stand in the trees. Mara was asleep behind him, her hand resting near her daughter's head. Tobin breathed in the steady, complete way of a child, finally sleeping deep enough to have a rest. Elsie made a small sound and settled again. Silas Rourke stood at the wall in the dark with his rifle, and the fire burning low behind him, and looked out at the tree line where a dangerous man had just been standing. He looked at it for a long time. Then he took a breath and put his back to the wall and stood between his window and the people sleeping behind him. And he was still standing there when the first gray light of morning finally reached Frostpine Ridge. He told Mara about Pike at first light. He didn't soften it. He'd learned by now that softening things for Mara Bellamy was a waste of both. Their time she processed hard information better than most men he'd known, and what she needed from him was accuracy, not comfort. So he told her plainly, a man had stood at the tree line at 3 a.m, had studied the cabin, had left without attempting anything. A man who matched nothing in the profile of Strake's hired hands. A man who moved like someone with his own agenda and his own timeline. Mara listened without interrupting. She was feeding Elsie, her attention apparently divided, but he'd noticed over the past few days that the division was only apparent. She was fully present for both things simultaneously, the way people get when survival demands it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Pike, she said. That's what I think. He didn't try anything. Not yet. He was looking. Silas sat at the table and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The fire was built up, and the cabin was as warm as it was going to get. He didn't come with Strake's men yesterday. He watched from outside and he waited. That's a different kind of man than Strake. Calder's letter said he was patient, Mara said quietly. He came twice for the surveys, months apart. He didn't rush. Patient men are harder to predict than impatient ones, Silas said. Strake moves when he's angry. Pike moves when he's ready. And when will he be ready? Silas looked at his coffee. Soon. Because Strake almost had the documents yesterday and didn't get them, which means Strake is going to push harder. And when Strake pushes harder, Pike will decide that the situation is getting too noisy, and he'll want it resolved before it draws attention he doesn't want. Tobin had woken sometime in the middle of this conversation and was sitting at the far end of the table, eating the last of the dried biscuits Silas had found in the back of his provisions chest. He was listening. He was always listening. Silas had stopped editing what he said in front of the boy because the editing was clearly pointless. Tobin absorbed everything and said nothing, and then occasionally asked one precise question that demonstrated he'd understood more than Dulce had given him credit for. What's silver worth? Tobin asked now, looking at his biscuit. Mara looked at him. Enough that someone would kill for it? The boy said. Neither adult answered immediately, because it was such a direct question, and the direct answer was yes, and saying yes to a 6-year-old about why his father was dead was not something either of them could do without the words costing them something. Yes, Silas said finally, because the boy deserved the truth even when the truth was ugly. Enough for that. Tobin nodded slowly. He looked at his biscuit again. Papa didn't know. No, Mara said softly, he didn't. He would have been more careful if he knew. Yes, she said, he would have. Tobin was quiet for a moment. Then he looked up at Silas with those careful eyes. You knew about Pike before yesterday? Not his name. I knew there was something bigger behind Strake's play. A cattle baron doesn't arrange a widow's removal personally just over a disputed debt. The risk isn't worth it for a man like Strake unless the prize is considerably larger than it looks. But you helped us anyway, Tobin said. Not an accusation. Pure curiosity. The kind children have when they genuinely don't understand a choice an adult made. Silas looked at him. Yeah. Why? It was the same question Mara had asked him that first night, in essentially the same words, and he hadn't had a clean answer then and didn't have one now. The true answer was complicated. Interrogatory. He didn't examine often in the specific quality of what he'd felt, watching Mara curl herself around her children in the snow. In the ways of the sight of it had reached past 12 years of careful numbness and found something underneath that was apparently still alive. Because it was the right thing to do, he said, which was true if incomplete. Tobin considered this with the same methodical seriousness he applied to everything. Then he went back to his biscuit, apparently satisfied, and Silas had the uncomfortable sensation of having been evaluated by someone much younger than him and having just barely passed. The morning moved forward with the particular slow tension of waiting for something inevitable. Silas spent part of it reinforcing the cabin as much as he could. With what he had, he was under no illusion that the structure would hold against a determined assault, but there was a difference between falling quickly and falling slowly, and slow was what they needed. He moved the table against the wall below the window. He organized the ammunition he had into 2 piles, what was loaded and immediately accessible, and what required preparation. He went through the cabin with the systematic attention of someone who has spent time in situations where knowing where everything is becomes the difference between good outcomes and bad ones. Mara watched him do this without comment for a while. Then she started doing it too, moving things, thinking about the space, using the same practical intelligence she applied to everything. They worked without talking much, and didn't get in each other's way, which he noticed without remarking on. Around mid-morning, she said from across the room, "Tell me about your wife." He stopped what he was doing. He was holding a spare timber brace he'd been fitting against the doorframe, and he held it for a moment without moving. "Why?" he said. "Because you've been alone out here for 12 years, and I want to understand why. And I think the answer to that explains more about who you are than anything else." She wasn't looking at him. She was arranging things near the window with her back to him, giving him the distance to answer or not. "You don't have to." He set the brace down. He looked at the door for a moment. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was from Ohio. She had no business being in Wyoming, and she knew it and came anyway because she wanted the life." He paused. "She was practical the way you're practical. Got things done without making a production of it." He stopped again. "My daughter was 4. Her name was June. She looked like Clara, and she laughed exactly the way Clara laughed. This particular sudden, he stopped. Mara didn't turn around. Fever came through in 75, he said, the winter one. It went through the valley and took a lot of people, and it took them. He picked up the timber brace again. I stayed because there was nowhere to go, and then staying became the thing I did. You stopped letting people in, she said, still not looking. I stopped seeing the point of it. She was quiet for a moment. I understand that. I know you do. She turned then, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything else about it because there was nothing else that needed saying. Some understandings don't need language to complete them. They just need to be acknowledged and then set aside so the work can continue. They continued. Elsie spent the morning being uncooperative about sleeping, which under any other circumstances would have been an ordinary frustration, and under these circumstances was a secondary concern that occasionally became a primary one when she expressed her views loudly, enough to make listening for sounds outside impossible. Silas found himself at one point walking a slow circuit of the cabin's interior with the baby against his shoulder and one ear cocked toward the door, which was an arrangement he would not have predicted for himself 72 hours ago, and which he had no particular feelings about except that it worked, and working was enough. Tobin fell asleep in the chair by the stove around noon, which surprised no one. The boy had been running on borrowed energy for days. Mara covered him with a spare blanket and tucked the edges in without waking him, and the gentleness of the gesture was so ordinary and so at odds with the situation they were in that Silas had to look away. The first shot came in the early afternoon. It didn't come from the road. It came from the east, from the timber side, the same direction the figure had approached from last night, and it was a single rifle shot that went through the south window and took a piece out of the back wall, about 8 inches above where Tobin was sleeping. 8 inches. Silas had Tobin off the chair and into the floor corner, and Mara down behind the table before the sound of the shot had finished echoing off the ridge. He moved fast but not panicked. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford, and positioned himself at the wall beside the window frame the way he'd been standing last night, out of the direct angle. Tobin was wide awake. He was on the floor with his knees pulled up and his back in the corner, Elsie already transferred to him from Silas's shoulder in the 2 seconds of reorganization, and he was holding his sister and looking at Silas with eyes that were frightened and controlled in equal measure. "Stay down," Silas said. "Both of you. Don't move from that corner." Another shot. This one hit the door, a test of the reinforcement, Silas thought, or a signal, or both. "How many?" Mara said. She was behind the table, Silas's rifle in her hands, already positioned with a sight line on the door. "Can't tell yet." He looked through the window seam. The timber to the east was still too still, the specific stillness of people in it. More than 2, less than 10. That's not helpful. Working on it. A third shot, and this one was different. It came from the south, from the roadside, which meant they'd split the approach. Silas recalculated instantly. Someone in the timber to the east, someone on the road to the south. 2 angles. 1 window, 1 door. "They're trying to pin us," he said. "Is it Strake or Pike?" "Might be both." He heard something then, not a shot, not a voice, but the particular mechanical sound of a rifle being reloaded at a specific distance and a specific angle that told him the eastern shooter was about yards out and slightly elevated. A good position. Someone had picked it deliberately. That was not how Strake's men worked. Strake's men were hired muscle, not tacticians. "Pike's out there," Silas said. Before Mara could answer, the door took 2 rapid shots in succession close together, both at the bar height, and Silas felt the door shift against its frame and knew the bar bracket he'd reinforced was holding but not indefinitely. Whoever was on the roadside was trying to get through the door, while the eastern shooter kept Silas away from the window. Coordinated, patient. This was Pike's play, not Strake's. "Mara," he said, "the eastern window, I need 30 seconds at it without being shot. Can you give me anything on the roadside?" She didn't hesitate. She moved from behind the table in a low, fast crouch, reached the south wall, angled the rifle through the gap between the shutterboards, and fired twice in rapid succession toward the road. She couldn't see what she was shooting at. That wasn't the point. The point was the noise and the response time, and the fact that the man at the door had to make a different calculation now. She bought him the 30 seconds. Silas got to the window and looked. He saw 2 men in the timber, positioned behind separate trees, and he saw that neither of them was watching the window right now because both of them were watching something else, watching the roadside, the door, coordinating. He took the moment because the moment was what he had. He fired once. The man behind the left tree took it in the shoulder and went down hard, and the second man pivoted immediately, and Silas pulled back before the return shot came through the window frame and took a chunk of log out of the wall beside his head. One down. At least 4 or 5 to account for. The calculation had improved, but not enough. "Door's going to go," Mara said from the south wall. Her voice was flat and informational, the same tone she used for everything. He would have found it remarkable in any other context. "I know," he thought fast. Outgunned in a fixed position against a tactical approach in diminishing time. The 3 days he'd needed had compressed into something much shorter, and Hatter's nephew might be halfway to Millhaven, or he might have been stopped on the road, and there was no way to know. Then he looked at Tobin. The boy was in the corner with Elsie, pressed back against the logs, watching everything with those careful eyes. Not paralyzed. Watching. Waiting the way Silas had told him to wait. The way he'd learned to wait. A thought arrived in Silas's mind, fully formed and terrible in its simplicity. Tobin. He crossed the room in 3 steps and knelt in front of the boy. "Listen to me carefully." Tobin looked at him. Elsie had gone quiet the way she went quiet sometimes in loud situations, overwhelmed into silence. There's a way out of this cabin that doesn't go through the door or the window. The floorboard under the east wall, the one that's darker than the others. You press it, it's on the left side, and it lifts. It leads to a crawl space that comes out behind the woodpile, 12 feet north of the cabin. Tobin's eyes were steady. He was listening to every word. "It's tight, but you can fit. Can you carry Elsie through something tight?" "Yes," Tobin said immediately. "From behind the woodpile you run north into the trees, same direction as before. You know the creek line. You know the trapper's shelter. You remember what I told you about Marshall Vale? Vale. Millhaven. Tell him where you are and what happened." "That's right." Silas looked at him for a moment, this boy. This 6-year-old boy who should have been worrying about entirely different things. "You go when I tell you to go. Not before. When I say go, you take Elsie and you go fast and you don't look back. Do you understand? What about Mama? Your Mama and I are going to be right behind you." Tobin looked at him with those eyes that saw too much. "You're not sure about that." It wasn't an accusation. It was just accurate, and they both knew it. "No," Silas said. "I'm not sure. But I'm sure about you. I'm sure you can do this." He held the boy's gaze. "Your papa left evidence to protect your family. Now I need you to carry the most important part of it out of here. You understand?" Tobin glanced at the leather pouch that was sitting inside Mara's coat on the floor near the corner. He looked back at Silas. "The papers. You take them with you. You give them to Vale and nobody else. If anyone tries to take them from you who isn't a federal marshal, you run." The door shuddered under another impact. Not a shot, something heavier. They were trying to break the bar now. Mara had come away from the south wall and was crouching beside Silas. She'd heard all of it. She looked at Tobin, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that was private and complete and needed no words. The specific communication of a mother and a child who understood each other past the surface of things. "Okay," Tobin said. He said it the same way he'd said okay that first night in the dark when Silas had told him someone might come, and he'd asked what Silas would do, and Silas had said he'd handle it, and Tobin had said okay, like trying was enough. The word meant the same thing now. It meant I trust you. It meant I'm scared and I'm going to do it anyway. It meant I'm my mother's son and my father's son, and I understand what this costs, and I'm going to carry it. Silas reached over and tucked the leather pouch inside Tobin's coat and fastened the top button over it. His hands were not quite steady doing it, which he noticed and set aside. "When I say go," he said. He stood up and went back to the window. Mara positioned herself beside him, and for a moment they were side by side at the cabin wall, both of them looking at the same geometry, the door taking damage, the eastern timber, the road, the diminishing time, and calculating the same thing from their respective angles. "We make noise at both positions," she said quietly. "Draw their attention. Give him the window." "That's what I was thinking." "You go for the door and I cover the window," she said. "If we can get outside, we change the math. They've been shooting into a box. Outside it's different. It was a reasonable plan and a dangerous one, and he was aware that Mara had just proposed, putting herself in the line of fire, and was watching him to see if he'd try to argue her out of it. He didn't, because arguing her out of it would have been insulting to everything he'd learned about her in the past 3 days, and also because she was right. Outside was different. Outside was where he was most effective and least killable, and the same was probably true of her. On my count, he said. The door bar cracked. Not broke crack. One more hit and it was going to give. Now, he said. Instead of counting, he went for the door. He hit it shoulder first, going out fast and low, and the man on the roadside heavyset, one of Strake's regulars, was mid-swing with the timber he'd been using to batter the door and hadn't exactly no time to adjust before Silas was already past the doorframe and into him. The rifle went wide. Silas drove him back with a forearm across the chest, and the man's footing went in the ice, and they both went down in the snow. He heard Mara's rifle from inside 2 shots through the eastern window, covering the timber, and he heard the eastern shot stop for a moment, and he used the moment. He got up first. The heavy-set man was still trying to get his feet under him on the ice, and Silas hit him once, clean, and he stayed down. Then Strake was there. He'd been on the road, back from the initial approach, which was where men like Strake positioned themselves behind their hired violence, directing it. He came forward now with a rifle already raised and fired before Silas had fully turned. The shot took him in the left shoulder. Not through and through it lodged, and the impact spun him sideways and dropped him to one knee in the snow, and the cold that rushed into the wound immediately was so intense, it was almost worse than the heat that followed it. Silas did not go down all the way. He put his right hand in the snow and held himself up by will, because going down all the way was how this ended badly, and this was not going to end badly. Strake crossed to him fast. He dropped the rifle too close for it now and pulled a knife from his belt, and Silas looked up from his kneel in the snow and saw the pale eyes that had no particular feeling in them, the eyes of a man removing an inconvenience. Should have stayed out of it, Strake said. He brought the knife down. What stopped him was a fireplace iron. Mara came through the cabin door with it in both hands and swung it at Strake's knife hand with the focused, economical violence of a woman who had stopped being afraid somewhere in the past 3 days and replaced the fear with something considerably more useful. The crack of iron on wrist was audible. The knife went into the snow. Strake turned on her, and Silas surged up from the ground with his right arm and caught Strake across the body and drove him sideways. His left shoulder was burning and largely useless, but the rest of him was still functional, and he put everything functional into the next 30 seconds. And when it was done, Strake was face down in the snow, with Silas's knee in his back, and Silas's right hand twisted in his coat collar and not moving. Strake was not a small man. He was not a weak man. He was also 60 years old and had spent 20 years not personally doing his own violence, and Silas Rourke had spent 12 years in the mountains doing everything himself. Don't, Silas said. Just the one word, and something in the way he said it apparently was sufficient, because Strake went still. Mara stood beside them with the fireplace iron still in her hands, breathing hard. There was a cut on her cheek from something flying wood from the door, impact maybe, or debris from Nauschitz, and she was bleeding slightly and didn't appear to have noticed. The eastern shooting had stopped. He didn't know why. He didn't have time to find out, because that was when Ransom Pike stepped out of the timber, and everything changed. He was tall, as Silas had registered last night at the tree line, with the kind of build that suggested he had done physical work at some point, but the real danger in him wasn't physical. Most of its windows were dark. It was in the way he moved unhurried, completely controlled, and in the way he looked at the scene in front of him with the detached analytical quality of a man who had just run the numbers in his head and arrived at a new set of conclusions. He was carrying his rifle loose at his side. He stopped about 15 yards out. Well, he said. His voice was not what Silas expected. Quiet, almost pleasant. The voice of a man who found social interactions useful tools rather than genuine exchanges. This is complicated. Strake made a sound from the snow under Silas's knee. Strake. Pike said it without looking at him. You've made a mess of this. Pike? Strake started. Don't. Pike finally looked at him, and the quality of attention in that look, Strake, go quiet in a way that Silas's physical control hadn't entirely managed. I told you 3 weeks ago to let me handle the widow, and you decided to do it your way. He looked back at Silas, and then at Mara. Mrs. Bellamy, I owe you an apology. Not for what I'm going to do, but for how messy this has gotten. Mara looked at him. Her breathing had steadied. You killed my husband. Pike tilted his head slightly. It wasn't a denial, and it wasn't a confirmation. It was the gesture of a man considering how much honesty was useful here. Your husband found my survey markers on his river property and started asking questions in Millhaven. That created a problem I needed to resolve. He paused. I regret that it required that particular solution. He seemed like a decent man. He was, Mara said. Yes. Pike looked at her with something that was almost genuine. The leather pouch, he said. I know you have it. I need it. It's not here, Silas said. Pike looked at him. The assessment in that look was specific and complete measuring, recalculating. No, he said slowly. You're right-handed, and you're holding straight down with your right hand. The pouch isn't in the cabin. I would have seen it when I was looking through the window seam. He paused. The boy. Silas felt the specific cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Where is he? Pike said. Not to Silas. To Mara. Watching her face for the thing that faces give away regardless of intention. Mara's face gave away nothing. She had the same control she'd had since the first night, the deliberate composure of someone who'd learned to manage the outside of themselves independent of the inside. Her eyes were on Pike, and they didn't move toward the woodpile to the north, didn't move toward the trees, didn't move to any point on the compass that would answer his question. Pike looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised the rifle and pointed it at Silas. I'll ask once more, he said the boy. Where is he? I don't know, Mara said. I told him to run when the shooting started. Which direction? Whichever one he chose. Pike studied her. He was deciding whether she was lying, and the answer he was arriving at was that he couldn't tell, which was the correct answer. Because Mara Bellamy was almost impossible to read when she chose to be. Step away from Strake, Pike said to Silas. Silas calculated. From his kneel in the snow with a useless left arm and a rifle pointed at him, the calculation was not favorable. He stood up and stepped back. Strake got up slowly, picking up his knife from the snow. His wrist was swelling from where Mara had hit it, and he was holding the knife in his other hand, which meant he was going to be clumsy with it, which was a small consolation. The documents are already in Federal Marshal Orson Vale's hands, Silas said. He let the lie come out clean and flat, the way he'd told Mara he was going to handle things. We made a copy. We sent a writer yesterday. Pike looked at him. It's done, Silas said. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish here, you've already lost the documents. You kill us and all you've done is add 3 more bodies to the count and given Vale more to work with, not less. Pike was quiet for a long moment. The analytical quality of his silence was not comfortable. He was working through it the way a careful man works through a problem, checking the logic, looking for the flaw, deciding whether the variable Silas had introduced changed his model enough to matter. That's a significant claim, Pike said. Hatter's nephew, Silas said. Rode out yesterday evening. Good horse. Knows the road. He kept his eyes on Pike. You've been watching this cabin since last night. You couldn't have caught him. Something moved in Pike's expression. Very small. A recalculation happening behind the eyes. Even if you're telling the truth, Pike said slowly, Vale has paper. I can manage paper. What I can't manage is a living witness who saw the survey markers. He paused. Calder Bellamy was a problem for that reason, Mrs. Bellamy is a problem for the same reason. He moved the rifle from Silas to Mara. And Silas did something he hadn't done since Clara and June. He reacted to the sight of a weapon pointed at someone else as though it were pointed at him. But, faster, without the half-second delay of self-preservation instinct that a weapon pointed at yourself creates. He moved toward Pike already, his right arm coming up, his ruined left side be damned. Because the alternative was watching the rifle go off, and there was not a version of that he was prepared to accept. Pike fired. The shot hit Silas in the side, high, and the impact knocked him backward and down, and he went into the snow on his back, and the cold of it came up through his coat immediately. He heard Mara make a sound. Not a scream. A sound with no category. He was still conscious. It hurt in the enormous, impersonal way serious. Wounds hurt, filling everything, but he could see the sky above him, pale winter gray, and he could hear, and he understood that he was still in the situation even if he was currently horizontal in it. Silas. Mara's voice. Close. She was beside him. He could feel her hand on his arm, and he wanted to tell her to get clear, to move, to stop being within reach of Pike's rifle. But the air wasn't cooperating. The papers, Pike said. Last time, he was standing over them both. The rifle was down at Tobin's level now, where a small child would be, if a small child were visible, which none was. He's gone, Silas said from the ground. His voice came out thinner than he wanted. You won't find him. I don't need to find him immediately, Pike said. I need the papers eventually, and right now I need the two of you to stop being a problem. He raised the rifle. Mara stood up. She put herself between Pike's rifle and Silas, which was not strategy. It was not calculation. It was the same automatic positioning she'd used in the snow to shield her children, in the farmhouse to shield Calder's documents, the instinctive placing of her body between the thing that mattered and the thing that threatened it. She stood in the snow with nothing in her hands, and she looked at Ransom Pike with her cut cheek and her stay darkas. And she was terrifying in the specific way that people become terrifying when they have run out of things to lose. You're going to shoot me, she said. Fine. Shoot me. Then you ride for Tobin, and you're going to be looking for a 6-year-old child in a mountain of forest in winter. And you're not going to find him before Orson Vale gets here. And when Vale gets here, he's going to have a widow's testimony and a dead body and Calder's documents and your name. Pike looked at her. Your name is in Calder's letter, she said. Ransom Pike. Survey work, dates, locations. Every detail my husband wrote down. She held his gaze. You wanted no witnesses. You're out of time. From somewhere behind the woodpile to the north, too close suddenly, much closer than the trapper's shelter, came the distant but unmistakable sound of horses. Multiple horses. Moving fast, coming from the north road. Pike heard it. He turned toward the sound. His composure cracked for the first time, a small visible fracture. There and gone, but real. He looked at the tree line, at the road, at the two people in the snow in front of him, and the calculation behind his eyes shifted rapidly. Silas got himself onto one elbow. His side was on fire. He looked at Mara, still standing, still between him and Pike, and he thought, Calder Bellamy knew exactly what he had when he married this woman. The horses were getting louder. Pike made a decision. He turned and moved toward the timber. Fast now, the unhurried Qualgon. And Strake looked at him and at the approaching sound and at the two people in the snow and at the rifle he was holding that suddenly felt like evidence rather than a tool. And the specific arithmetic of self-preservation reached its answer in Strake's face. Strake ran. Not toward the timber where Pike had gone. South, toward the road, away. He didn't get far. The first riders came over the rise from the north road, at a pace that said they'd been riding hard for a long time, and at their head, on a brown mare that was blowing hard and foam-flecked, was a man Silas recognized even from the ground old, heavy through the middle, moving with the stiff deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about winter riding, that he was ignoring. Marshal Orson Vale, behind him, 6 armed men, and beside Vale, pressed against the saddle of a horse he was clearly not comfortable on, Hatter's 19-year-old nephew, looking windburned and exhausted and completely serious. Strake pulled up in the snow when he saw them. He stood there for a moment with the knife in his wrong hand, looking at 6 rifles, and the calculation reached its inevitable end. He dropped the knife. Vale pulled up his mare and looked down at the scene, the cabin, with its shot-out window, the unconscious hired man in the snow. Mara standing over Silas with blood on her face and a fireplace iron in her hands. Silas on the ground, with 2 fresh wounds and the particular expression of a man who has decided he's not dying today and is working out the details. Vale looked at all of it for a long moment. Mrs. Bellamy, he said. His voice was exactly as Silas had described it, inflexible, without warmth or its opposite, the voice of a man who followed the law like weather followed physics. You all right? I need a doctor for this man, Mara said. She didn't answer the question because the question wasn't important. She pointed at Silas. Now Pike, Silas said from the ground. He went into the timber, east side. Vale was already moving, sending 2 riders into the timber with a single-hand gesture. He looked at the men around him, and another gesture, had 2 more riders moving toward the road after Strake, who was standing with his hands up, and the expression of a man whose entire model of how the world worked had just been revised. Then Vale got off his horse carefully, because his knees were bad, and the saddle was high, and crouched beside Silas. with the unhurried assessment of a man who had seen worse and was deciding how worried to be. "You look bad," Vale said. "I've been told that before," Silas said. Vale almost smiled. It was a very small almost. Shoulder inside. Shoulders through. Side I can't tell. He looked up at Mara. "How long has he been down?" 4 minutes, she said precisely, because Mara Bellamy always knew how long things had been. "He'll manage," Vale said in the tone of a man stating a fact he'd decided on. He stood up. "Get him inside." Mara knelt beside Silas. She got her arm under his right side, and he got his right hand into the snow, and they worked together to get him up, which was undignified and painful and accomplished. And she didn't make any comment about any of it, just provided the leverage he needed and let him use it. At the woodpile to the north, a small figure emerged from behind the stacked logs. Tobin's windows were dark. Tobin stood in the snow with Elsie against his chest and the leather pouch buttoned inside his coat and watched the riders and the marshal and the men with their hands up. And then he looked at Silas and Mara making their slow way toward the cabin door, and he started moving toward them. He was not running. He was walking with the particular careful deliberateness of someone carrying something important and not willing to fall. He reached them at the door. Mara looked down at him, and whatever she'd been holding together for the past 4 days cracked slightly, not completely, not openly, just slightly, a small fracture in the careful composure, and she put her free hand on his head and held it there. "I didn't go to the shelter," Tobin said. "I heard everything from the woodpile. I was going to get the horses if I needed to." "I know," Mara said. "I kept the papers. I know that too." He looked up at Silas, who was leaning heavily on Mara's support and breathing through his teeth. "You said you'd be right behind me," Tobin said. "Took a little longer than expected," Silas said. Tobin considered this. Then he reached up with his free hand and took hold of the edge of Silas's coat, the way he'd held his mother's coat through every hard thing in the past weeks, the same grip, instinctive, certain. Silas looked down at the boy's hand on his coat. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. They went inside. The Dr. Vale brought from Millhaven was a small, irritable man named Pruitt who smelled of tobacco and had the bedside manner of someone who had long ago stopped pretending that medicine was anything other than a negotiation with the body's stubbornness. He arrived at the cabin 2 hours after the shooting stopped, took one look at Silas on the bed, and said "Sapsianam's" worse in a tone that made it sound like a criticism rather than a reassurance. He dug the bullet out of Silas's side without ceremony and with a minimal amount of conversation, which Silas appreciated. The shoulder had gone through clean, as Vale had assessed in one side, out the other, missing everything that mattered by margins, that Pruitt described as lucky, plus with the inflection of a man who believed luck was mostly stupidity that happened to work out. The side wound was the serious one, deep enough to need work, not deep enough to be immediately fatal, which was the category Silas filed it under and moved on. He was awake for all of it. He didn't make much noise, which seemed to irritate Pruitt for reasons that weren't entirely clear, as though the man had developed his brusqueness partly as a defense against the sounds his patients made and was now at a loss without them. Mara sat in a chair beside the bed and didn't hold Silas's hand, because he hadn't asked her to, and she understood him well enough by now to know that what he needed was not comfort but company, which was a different thing entirely. She was just present. That was enough. It turned out to be exactly enough. Tark? Tobin sat on the floor near the stove sea, with Elsie in his lap, both of them watching Pruitt work with the focused attention of children and adults who have learned that understanding a situation, however unpleasant, is preferable to not understanding it. Elsie reached for the doctor's bag once, and Tobin redirected her hand with the automatic patience of a boy who had been doing this since before he should have needed to, and Pruitt glanced at them, and something briefly complicated crossed his face, and then was gone. "You'll live," Pruitt announced when he was done. He said it like a verdict he wasn't entirely pleased to deliver, cleaned his hands, and went to find Vale. Silas lay on his back and looked at the ceiling. "He's charming," Mara said. "Best doctor in the county," Silas said. "Doesn't mean he has to be pleasant about it." She almost smiled. He was starting to be able to predict those almost smiles, the slight relaxation around her eyes, before her mouth caught up. He'd begun noticing when they happened, which was something he'd noted about himself without knowing what to do with noting. "Tobin," he said. The boy looked up from the floor. "You did well today." Tobin considered this with the seriousness he applied to everything. I didn't do very much, he said. I just waited, like you told me. That was the job, Silas said. Doing the job when it's hard is doing well. Tobin looked at Elsie for a moment, then back at Silas. The papers are on the table, he said. I took them out of my coat when the doctor came. I didn't want him to ask about them. Silas looked at the table. The leather pouch was there, the cord loosely tied, sitting next to his coffee cup as though it were an ordinary object in an ordinary morning. Good thinking, Silas said. Tobin nodded and went back to redirecting Elsie's reach toward Pruitt's abandoned instruments. Vale came in from outside about an hour later, moving with the deliberate economy of a man whose body had accumulated a specific number of years and had strong opinions about expenditure. He took the chair Mara vacated and looked at Silas on the bed with the expression of a man conducting an informal proceeding. Pike's in custody, he said. Took us 40 minutes in that timber. He's fast for a tall man. Did he give you trouble? Some. Vale's expression didn't change. My deputy gave him more. It evened out. He looked at the leather pouch on the table. That's Calder Bellamy's documentation? Receipt for the debt payment. Letter in Calder's hand naming Pike and describing the unauthorized surveys. Silas paused to manage a breath that pulled wrong against the bandaging. Should be. Enough. It's enough, Vale said, with the flat certainty of someone who had looked at evidence for 30 years and knew what would hold and what wouldn't. The receipt alone kills Strake's property claim. Witnessed, dated, signed by his own land agent. That's not a disputed document, that's a closed case. He paused. Pike's the harder work. Murder charge needs more than a dead man's letter. But the letter creates probable cause, which gets me access to records I couldn't touch before, and Pike's the kind of man who kept records because he thought no one would ever get to them. A long pause. Men like that always keep records. What about Strake? Fraud, conspiracy, destruction of property. Vale listed them without inflection, the way a man reads a bill. He'll lose everything that matters to him, the land influence, the legal standing. Whether he sees a prison cell depends on how much the fraud charge sticks without direct evidence of the murder. He looked at his hands. It may not be perfect. It rarely is, Silas said. No. Vale looked at him. But Mrs. Bellamy gets her land back. That's certain. And Pike answers for Calder's death. That's where I'll put my energy. He stood, which took a moment longer than it used to. You rest. Pruitt says 2 weeks minimum before you're functional. Pruitt exaggerates. Pruitt is the best doctor in the county, and you'll do what he says, Vale said, and left. Mara came back to the chair. She sat and looked at Silas, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there had been a great deal of noise in the past 4 days, and the quiet was not uncomfortable. It's over, she said, testing the words. Mostly, he said. The legal part will take time. Bill's right that it won't be perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect, she said. It has to be enough. She looked at the pouch on the table. Calder made sure it would be enough. He was always thinking ahead like that, always planning for the version of things that went wrong. Her voice softened but didn't break. I used to tease him about it. Tell him he worried too much. Silas was quiet. I'm glad he worried, she said. She reached over and picked up Elsie from Tobin's lap, and the baby grabbed immediately of her coat with both a proprietary grip, and Mara put her face down against the baby's head for a moment and closed her eyes. Silas looked at the ceiling again. He thought about Clara, which he did less than people might have expected and more than he ever admitted. He thought about the particular quality of her practicality, the specific way she approached problems, which was he understood now with the clarity that comes from distance and time, not entirely unlike the way Mara approached them. He thought of whether this observation meant something, or whether he was just an injured man in a warm cabin making connections that weren't there. He decided it meant something, and that he wasn't ready to look at what it meant, and filed it accordingly. The next 2 weeks were not 2 weeks Silas would have chosen if choosing had been available. Pruitt's instructions were specific, and his follow-through on enforcing them was assisted by Mara, who had apparently decided that her role in his recovery included making sure he did not undo Pruitt's work by doing something functionally stupid ahead of schedule. He pushed back on this twice, once trying to get up to check the cabin structure on the 3rd day, once attempting to split wood on the 6th because the pile was getting low and it bothered him. And both times Mara gave him the look, which he had come to understand as a specific expression that occupied the space between "I am not telling you what to do" and "I absolutely am telling you what to do." And both times he sat back down. He wasn't used to being cared for. He'd been alone long enough that the concept had gone from uncomfortable to foreign, and having someone check his bandaging and bring him food and notice without being asked when the fire needed building and when the water needed heating was he didn't have a clean word for it. It nestled against him like weight, the particular weight of something you'd been carrying the absence of for so long you'd forgotten you were carrying anything. He didn't say any of this. Tobin helped him with the things Mara couldn't do alone, holding timber while she nailed it, carrying water from the creek that was too heavy for one person to manage efficiently in the conditions, performing the dozen small logistical tasks that a household in winter required without any of it being remarked upon as extraordinary, because Tobin had clearly been raised to understand that work was not remarkable. It was just what you did. The boys had also, somewhere in the chaos of the past week, decided that the cabin was his territory to understand, and he spent several mornings in quiet exploratory examination of its systems and arrangements, asking questions occasionally with the direct practicality of a child who wanted information rather than conversation. "Why is the stovepipe angled that way?" he asked on the fourth morning. "Wind comes from the northwest in this valley," Silas said. "That angle reduces backdraft." Tobin looked at it, processing. "Did you figure that out yourself?" "Made the mistake first and figured it out after." "What was the mistake?" "Cabin full of smoke for 2 days." Tobin nodded sagely. "Papa did something like that with the barn ventilation," he said. "Mama told him to check the wind direction first, and he said he knew, and then he did it wrong." Silas looked at the boy. "What did your mama say when it didn't work?" "Nothing," Tobin said. "She just fixed it while he was in town." A pause. "She does that a lot. Fixes things without saying she fixed them." Silas thought about that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I've noticed." Tobin looked at him with the evaluating quality he sometimes had. "You like her," he said. "Not a question. The statement of someone reporting an observable fact." "She's a good person," Silas said carefully. Tobin considered this precision and appeared to find it insufficient, but decided not to push, which suggested a social intelligence that also seemed to have come from Mara's side of his inheritance. He went back to looking at the stovepipe. "I liked your barn," he said after a moment, "before it burned." Silas looked at the boy. "I know. Are you going to build another one?" It was such a simple, forward-facing question. Assuming continuity, assuming tomorrow, assuming that Silas would still be here building things, which was the kind of assumption Silas hadn't made about himself in a very long time. "Probably," he said. Tobin nodded as though this were settled, and it occurred to Silas that for the boy it was settled, the way things were settled for children who had found something solid to stand on after a period of having no solid ground, quickly, completely, with the efficiency of someone who needed the stability and wasn't going to overcomplicate the accepting of it. The legal proceedings moved faster than Vail had predicted, which the marshal later attributed to the quality of the documents and the fact that Strake's land agent, facing his own charges as a party to the fraudulent filing, cooperated extensively and immediately. Strake lost the Bellamy property claim within 3 weeks of Vail's arrival. He lost most of his other landholdings within 2 months, as the investigation that Calder's documents initiated pulled thread after thread in a web that turned out to be considerably larger than one widow's ranch. Strake had done this before, not murder, but the fraudulent debt mechanism applied to 3 other properties in the valley over 10 years. All 3 families had left, assuming the debt was real and the law wasn't interested. 2 of them came back when the truth emerged. 1 didn't, which was a specific kind of damage that legal vindication couldn't fully repair. Strake did not see a prison cell. This was the imperfect part. Vail had warned about the fraud conviction, carried fines and loss of property, and the complete destruction of his influence in the valley, but the direct evidence connecting him to Calder's death never materialized in a form the court would accept. Silas heard this news and felt a flat, cold dissatisfaction with it, the kind that didn't have anywhere to go because the system had gone as far as the system could go, and raging at the gap between justice and the law was a thing men did. That changed nothing, he told Mara. She was quiet for a moment. They were sitting at the table, his table. Still, Though the cabin had gradually acquired the specific atmosphere of a place more than one person lived in, things moved, additions made, the quality of occupied space that was different from the quality of a single person's territory. She was mending one of Tobin's shirts, and she kept mending while she absorbed the news, her hands continuing their work with the independence that hands develop when they've done a task long enough. He loses everything that made him Strake, she said finally. The land, the money, the fear. She looked up. People in this valley were afraid of him for 20 years. Nobody will be afraid of him now. That's true, Silas said. Pike answers for Calder. Vale says the evidence is clean. It'll hold. She looked back at her mending. Then it's enough, she said. It has to be. He watched her hands, the certainty in them, the same certainty she'd had, standing between him and Pike's rifle in the snow. Not fearlessness, because she'd been frightened every step of the way, and he'd watched her manage the fear like a craftsman manages a difficult material, working with it rather than trying to eliminate it. That was if its windows were dark. That was the thing about Mara Bellamy that he'd been turning over for 2 weeks, that he kept arriving at from different directions. She was not extraordinary because she felt nothing. She was extraordinary because she felt everything and kept going anyway. The property's clear, he said. Vale's office sent the paperwork. The Bellamy Ranch is yours. Clear title, no claim outstanding. She stopped mending. She looked at the table for a moment. Calder's, she said softly. He worked that land for 8 years. Yours and Calder's, Silas said, and Tobin's and Elsie's. She nodded slowly, the nod of someone accepting something large enough that accepting it took more than one motion. I'll need to go back, she said. The ranch will need work. The house will need going through. She paused. I'll need to get the children settled. Yes, Silas said. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable, but that had things in it, specific things, neither of them looking at directly. You could come, she said. She said it looking at the shirt in her hands, not at him. When you're well enough. If you wanted to see the property, give an opinion on what needs doing first. I know what I'd say needs doing first, he said. The fencing on the riverside. If there are silver deposits under that acreage, prospectors are going to be crossing it the moment the word gets out. She looked up then. Something in her expression that was partly practical consideration of fencings and partly something else entirely. That's a good reason to come, she said. It's a reason, he agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire in the stove made its particular sound, the low even burn of wood that had caught properly and was doing its work without drama. Silas, she said, I want to say something and I need you to let me finish before you say anything practical. He waited. You opened your door in a blizzard for 3 strangers, she said. You lost your barn and your horses and your traps. You got shot twice. You stood between my children and men with guns and you did it without being asked. She stopped. Started again. You did it because it was right, and I know that's how you'll explain it, and I know you believe that's the whole explanation. But I've watched you with Tobin for 2 weeks. I've watched you with Elsie. I've watched you sit up at night even when you were too hurt to be sitting up, because the habit of protecting us had become the thing you did. She paused. That's not just doing the right thing. That's something else. He didn't say anything practical. He'd been specifically asked not to. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I don't know what the next part looks like, and I'm not going to pretend I do, but I wanted you to know that I see it. What you did. What it cost. And I'm not going to let it be something that just... She pressed her lips together briefly. I'm not going to let it be something that just happened, and then was over. Silas looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. Clara would have liked you, he said. Mara was quiet, receiving this. She was particular about people, he said. She had no patience, for he paused, finding the word performance. People performing goodness instead of just being it. She would have looked at you the same way. She looked at the very few people she respected, which was directly, without a lot of additional commentary. Mara was watching him with an expression he'd stopped trying to fully decode because full decoding wasn't the point. The point was that she was listening in the way she listened completely, without filling in the spaces before he'd finished with them. I've been out here a long time, he said, and I told myself that was fine, that the quiet was what I needed after. He stopped. I think I was wrong about that. I think I confused necessary with permanent. People do that, she said. You didn't. You could have. I had Tobin, she said, and then Elsie. I didn't have the option of disappearing into the quiet. She paused. But I understand the pull of it. The way it gets easier every year to stop expecting things from the world. Yeah. They sat with that for a moment, the mutual recognition of it. Two people who had learned to live in diminished versions of their own lives and were now sitting across a table from the alternative. Come see the fencing, she said finally. The corner of her mouth moved. When you're well enough. 2 weeks, Pruitt said. 2 weeks, he said again, and she looked at him and saw that he meant it, and she went back to the mending with something in her bearing that was lighter than it had been before. A specific unburdening that wasn't happiness exactly, but was the thing that comes before happiness, the sense that happiness was no longer an unreasonable expectation. 3 days later, Clem Hatter came up the road with a wagon. In the wagon were materials timber, hardware nails, 2 lengths of good rope, and behind the wagon, tethered to the back, were 2 horses. Not young horses, not especially beautiful, but solid and sound, and exactly what the situation required. Silas stood on the porch, still moving carefully, and looked at the horses. Where? He said. Don't worry about it, Hatter said, getting down from the wagon with the slow deliberateness of a 73-year-old man who had made peace with his joints. Valley contributed. You did a thing that needed doing, and it cost you, and people noticed. He looked at Silas. Took long enough for some of them to notice. I grant you that. But they did. Mara had come onto the porch. She looked at the wagon, at the materials, at the horses, and her expression did the thing it occasionally did, the small involuntary crack in the surface, quickly managed, leaving just the evidence that something underneath had moved. Tell them thank you, she said. Tell them yourself, Hatter said. Most of them want to come up here directly, but they figured you'd had enough company. He looked at Silas. Parsons' family wants to help rebuild the barn when you're ready. Caleb Morse said the same. The Dunmore brothers. I'll think about it, Silas said. You'll accept it, Hatter said, with the flat authority of a man who had decided this wasn't negotiable. That's how it works out here, and you know it. You were just too stubborn to let it work for you for 12 years. He looked at the horses, at the cabin, at Mara on the porch. Looks like things are changing. He got back in his wagon and turned it around, and went back down the road the way he'd come, and Silas stood watching him go with the particular feeling of a man who has been seen by someone who knew him before the walls went up and is not entirely opposed to being seen. The barn went up in early spring. Not Silas's barn alone, the Parsons came, and Caleb Morse and the Dunmore brothers, who turned out to be large and efficient and cheerful in the specific way of men who liked physical work and were good at it. They came on a Saturday with tools and opinions and a collective practical energy that filled the cleared site of the old barn with noise and purpose. Hatter came and sat on an upturned bucket and supervised, which mostly meant commenting on technique and being ignored, which he seemed to enjoy. Silas worked alongside them. His shoulder had healed faster than Pruitt had predicted, which Pruitt took as a personal affront and attributed to stubbornness rather than constitution. His side still pulled if he moved wrong, but he'd learned the specific movements that pulled it and mostly avoided them, except occasionally when he forgot, which happened less and less. Mara was there. She'd been going back and forth between the cabin and the Bellamy Ranch, as the work on both properties required organizing, making decisions, managing the specific enormous complexity of restoring a household that had been abandoned and stripped. She brought Tobin and Elsie to the barn raising, and Tobin spent most of the morning being handed tools and carrying lumber with the seriousness of someone given a genuine task and determined to do it genuinely, and Elsie spent most of it being passed between whoever wasn't currently doing something that required both hands, which included, at one point, Caleb Morse, who was 60 and childless and handled the baby with the startled tenderness of a man, being reminded of something he'd almost forgotten he'd ever wanted. By evening, the barn frame was up and the roof work was started. Someone had foods had appeared without announcement. The way food appeared at these gatherings, as though it materialized from the collective will of people who understood that work needed feeding. They ate outside in the last of the spring light, the valley opening up below the ridge the way it did in the thaw, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes and revealing the brown beginnings of what would be green by June. Silas sat on a log with a plate and watched the group people talking, the Dunmore brothers arguing cheerfully about something that didn't matter. Hatter dispensing opinions to anyone who slowed down near him. Mara talking to the parson's wife about something that had them both leaning in with the focused attention of a practical conversation. He hadn't sat in the middle of a group of people in 12 years. He'd been aware of this, approaching the day, the way a person who's been still for a long time is aware of the first movement, the anticipation of whether it was going to hurt in a way that would stop him. It didn't hurt. It was strange and slightly too loud, and he said less than everyone else. But it was what he'd been bracing against. What he'd been bracing against the specific loneliness of being among people, rather than apart from them. The loneliness that had driven him out here in the first place wasn't there. Or it was there but smaller, reduced by something he couldn't name precisely, but that had something to do with the woman currently leaning in toward the parson's wife, 30 feet away from him. Tobin came and sat beside him on the log. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the group. "This is good," Tobin said, meaning the food or the gathering, or both or something larger than either. "Yeah," Silas said. "Are you going to come to our ranch?" Tobin asked. He'd been asking versions of this question with increasing directness. Over the past several weeks, his 6-year-old patience for indirection having reached its limit. Permanently, I mean. Not just for fencing. Silas looked at him. "Who told you about the fencing?" "Mama. She said you were coming to look at the fencing." "That's true. But also the other thing," Tobin said, was watching Silas with those eyes. "You could have your cabin. We could have the ranch. They're not that far apart." Silas looked at the cabin, at the barn frame against the evening light. He looked at Mara, who had looked up from her conversation and was looking back at him with the specific attention she had direct, unperformed, exactly seeing. "No," Silas said, "they're not that far apart." Tobin nodded as though this were settled, which it apparently was for him. "I want to learn to trap," he said. "When I'm old enough." "How old do you think old enough is?" Tobin considered. 8, 7, Silas said, "if you pay attention." Tobin's face did something that was completely unguarded. One of those moments of pure, uncomplicated pleasure that children had before they learned to moderate them, and Silas looked at it and felt something happen in his chest that was large and quiet, and that he was not going to examine closely tonight. Tonight it was enough to feel it and know what it was. The summer that followed moved the way good summers move, full of work and unremarkable difficulty, of things that needed doing and were done, of small decisions accumulating into a life. The Bellamy Ranch recovered slowly, the way things recovered, when someone was committed to the recovery and didn't expect it to be quick or easy. Mara made decisions about what to keep and what to change, and some of them she talked through with Silas, and some of them she made alone, and told him after, and the proportion between those two categories shifted gradually over the months, in a direction that neither of them marked as significant, except that it was. Silas went back and forth between the cabin and the ranch with the regularity of a man who has two places that are his and has stopped feeling the need to explain the arrangement to anyone, which was helped by the fact that the valley had largely stopped requiring explanation. People understood what the situation was. A few people had opinions about it, as people in small communities always did, and those opinions were expressed to each other rather than to Silas or Mara, which was the correct handling because neither Silas nor Mara had indicated any interest in other people's opinions about their lives. Hatter said once obliquely, "That folks talked." Silas looked at him. Hatter went back to his inventory. Vale returned to Millhaven with his case against Pike complete. It took and the cooperation of 2 men in 3 counties who had done survey work for Pike and were willing to testify to the pattern of it. Pike was tried and convicted of Calder Bellamy's murder in November. The verdict reached Frostpine Ridge by Ryder in the late afternoon, and Silas was at the Bellamy Ranch when it came, and he watched if its windows were dark, and he watched Mara read the message and watched her fold it carefully and put it in the box on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. She stood at the shelf with her back to him for a moment. "Calder's letter is in there," she said. "His original letter. I kept it." "I know," Silas said. He'd seen her put it there weeks ago. "I want Tobin and Elsie to have it when they're old enough to understand it," she said. "So they know what their father did, that he tried to protect them." She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the effort of that was visible in the set of her face, the specific controlled stillness that meant something was being held. He knew something was wrong, and he wrote it down and hid it for me to find. He did everything he could. He did, Silas said. It wasn't enough to save him. She pressed her lips together briefly, but it was enough to save us. Silas crossed the room and stood beside her, not touching, just present in the way he'd learned. She sometimes needed the company without the intrusion, the proximity without the demand. She stood beside him for a moment, and then did something she almost never did, which was lean slightly, just slightly, into his shoulder. Not a collapse, not a dramatic gesture, just the quiet allowance of another person's nearness. He stood there and let her. After a while, she straightened and went to make coffee, because that was how Mara processed things, by moving forward and doing the next functional thing, and he had come to understand this about her, the way he understood the particular angles of the wind on the ridge, and the specific behavior of the creek in the thaw, as simply a fact of the landscape he inhabited. The first snow of winter came in late October, earlier than usual, dropping overnight and leaving the valley white and quiet under a gray sky. Silas was at the ranch. He'd been there 3 days, helping with the final weatherproofing before the serious cold settled in, and in the morning he stood on the porch and looked at the familiar shape of the mountains under their first white and felt the winter the way he always felt it, present, real, the kind of cold that reminded you that comfort was earned and not guaranteed. He heard the door behind him, and then Tobin was beside him, boots on the wrong feet as usual, coat half-buttoned. "Snow," Tobin announced. "Good observation," Silas said. "Can we check the new trap lines today?" "It's the first snow. That's when you said we'd start." This was true. He had said that. He looked. Its windows were dark. He looked down at the boy, 7 now, taller than he'd been in the spring, with the particular lengthening that happened to children between one season and the next. He had Calder's coloring and Mara's eyes, and the specific quality of attention that was entirely his own. "Get your boots on the right feet," Silas said. Tobin looked down at his feet, made a face that indicated mild offense at the observation, and went back inside. Mara appeared in the doorway. She had Elsie on her hip, Elsie, who had opinions about everything now and expressed them continuously, who had taken her first steps across the cabin floor in August and had not slowed down since, who grabbed at whatever was nearest with the determined acquisitiveness of a child who had decided the quis ritual was hers to examine. "Trap lines?" Mara said. He remembered. He's been remembering since August. She shifted Elsie to her other hip. "He told me 3 weeks ago that you promised. I said when the snow came, and here it is." The corner of her mouth moved. "You'll have to stop making promises to him if you don't intend to keep them." "I intend to keep this one." She looked at him in the morning light, the white of the new snow reflected up into the gray sky. The ranch house behind her and the mountains beyond and the valley below that had learned, over the past year, to see them differently, not a dangerous recluse and a troublesome widow, but 2 people who had come through something hard together and built something out of the other side of it. He thought about what he would have told himself 12 years ago, standing in the door of an empty cabin, that the quiet was the goal, that removal was the answer, that the walls he was building were protection rather than prison. He would not have been in a position to hear the correction. Sometimes people weren't, until something came along large enough to reach past the certainty. 3 strangers in the snow had been that something. Or perhaps, more precisely, a woman who curled herself around her children in a blizzard and refused to be the thing that broke had been that something. And the children themselves, and the specific trust of a 6-year-old boy reaching up to hold the edge of his coat. "You're thinking," Mara said. "Sometimes," he said. "About?" He looked at the snow, at the mountains, at her. "The door," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "That first night," he said, opening it. He paused. "I've thought about what would have happened if I hadn't." She was quiet for a moment. The weight of the alternative was something neither of them had spoken about directly, the specific version of things where he'd looked at 3 strangers in the snow and calculated the trouble and turned away. "We would have died," she said simply. "Not for drama, just accurately." "Yes," he said, "and I would have gone on living." He looked at the mountains, which isn't the same thing. She understood what he meant. He saw it tint in her face, the full understanding of the distinction between surviving and living, which she had navigated herself, which was perhaps why she didn't offer a response to it. It didn't need one. Tobin came back through the door with his boots correctly deployed, coat properly fastened, with the specific look of a child who has completed a preparation and is ready to be taken seriously. Elsie made a loud sound at him that meant something in her personal language. And he said, I know to her with the long-suffering patience of an older sibling who has learned that the youngest member of the family has opinions that must be acknowledged even when they cannot be parsed. Let's go, Tobin said to Silas. Silas looked at Mara once more. She nodded slightly, the way she sometimes did not permission, just acknowledgement. The gesture of someone who had built something with another person and trusted the building. He stepped off the porch and into the snow, and Tobin fell into step beside him. With the ease of a child, walking next to someone who has become a fixed point in his landscape, ordinary and essential in the way that the creek and the tree line and the smell of the stove were ordinary and essential, not remarkable, just there, always there, the way the things that matter tend to be. Behind them, the ranch house stood solid in the new winter, warm light in the windows, Mara on the porch with Elsie watching them walk out toward the tree line. Frostpine Ridge spread white and merciless in every direction, the same as it had always been indifferent to human trouble, and indifferent to human recovery, indifferent to everything except the facts of cold and time and the endless work of enduring. Inside the ranch house, the fire burned for 4. It would burn for 4 again tomorrow, and the day after that, not because the world had become simpler or kinder or more just, because it hadn't. Strake had paid in property rather than prison. Pike had answered for Calder's death, but Calder was still gone and would always be gone. And the shape of his absence was in his wife's face and his son's eyes and would be for the rest of their lives, carried the way the lost are always carried, as both weight and ballast. But the fire burned. And a man who had spent 12 years proving that surviving was enough had discovered, in the space of 1 blizzard and 3 strangers, and the particular courage of a woman who refused to be the thing that broke, that it wasn't. It was the beginning. Living was the rest.